Hi everybody. I thought that I would go through this first half of the first assignment and walk you through some of the things that I look for in an essay like this. So, to start off with, the paragraph that walked in darkness, this is a sort of sample paragraph of bad writing that I actually picked up in grad school. It was used as an assignment in one of the courses that I taught as a TA in grad school, and a lot of us kind of went over it and talked about what was wrong, and we used to use it as a teaching technique. So I think it's a pretty effective paragraph. It's bad, but it's not horrible in the sense that you actually have to dig in and kind of ask yourself a little bit about why doesn't this work? What is this piece of writing missing? And that's what this assignment is meant to get you thinking about. So just to go through it. From the beginning, the first thing I would want to flag is the word impressive. An impressive technique doesn't tell us a whole lot as a word. It's a little bit better than something like interesting, which actually tells you almost nothing. Interesting is a very neutral word that doesn't convey much meaning. But impressive technique doesn't really tell us a whole lot, particularly when you continue on in the sentence. The impressive technique, namely that of word painting. Word painting is a pretty standard thing in classical music. As you'll see if you scroll down here to the microglossary, it's a pretty standard technique that's used in Baroque and classical music, basically to express the text by making the music do something that reflects the meaning of the language. So impressive isn't really doing much there. Next sentence, walking is immediately apparent by the fact that the tempo nearly always consists of the same notes in a slow rhythm. This needs to be a little bit more specific. Immediately apparent is the kind of a phrase that makes it sound like this is the author's opinion. This is what the author hears, and while that's not a bad thing in an academic paper, you want to be clear about that. This is something I hear versus this is something that is a characteristic that I can really identify in the music, or something that I can say that everybody hears. This plodding along is turned into wandering. So again, we've just kind of continued on. We haven't gotten enough of a detailed description of the walking pace. I suppose this is the opening passage of the music. That's supposed to be the walking pace. The plodding along is turned into wandering when notes seem to constantly slither around between each other and never ever rest. This sentence doesn't say much of anything. It doesn't give us any detail as far as how the notes slither, how they slither between each other and never ever rest. I don't think that that's a word that comes to mind here, slither, nor is it really clear why the change happens. The plodding along is turned into wandering. Action words are very good as musical descriptions, and so is the idea that one sort of metaphorical object musically is being turned into another one. That's a very compelling way to think of this melody as transformed, this chord is transformed, or this rhythm is transformed into something else. That's a very compelling way to talk about music, but it's not clear what is happening here or where this is happening. What actually changes to make the plodding turn into the slithering. Next, it is perhaps ironic that the texture is so incredibly simple. I'm not sure what they mean by ironic here. I really don't know what that word is supposed to mean in this case. Why it's ironic that the homophonic line is played by all the instruments. Homophonic is a pretty simple term that just means we have one sound, or the same sound. Multiple instruments are doing the same thing. Handel could have depicted people wandering here and there with a strongly polyphonic orchestra. This is a decent observation, actually. That one way to engage in word painting would have been to have different lines. Polyphonic is many sounds, multiple sounds, different instruments doing things that contrast with each other. That's a decent observation. I believe he resists this urge in order to help us see the great light of the second line of lyrics. It is happening every time. It happens every time. At this word, when we hear the beautiful chords, and we know this is the special light of the Lord. So this is like a very specific image. It's drawn from the lyrics, have seen a great light, have seen a great light. But it's kind of a leap to say that we hear these chords and we know this is what they mean. One of the details when you're writing about music is you always want to be interrogating, what does the piece of music actually tell me? Whether there are lyrics around to help with that or not. What is the piece of music telling me? In this case, what is my own experience telling me? All of you, no matter what your level of training, you probably still have a lot of experience listening to music, interpreting music, whether or not you've been formally trained. So it's always good to sort of interrogate this cultural inheritance. Why do I think this sounds like that? What is it about this music that makes, for example, this person say these are beautiful chords that expresses, the special light of the Lord? That's very specific. What exactly are they reacting to? I'm not going to critique the idea as a piece of analysis. It's their analysis of the piece that Handel sets, have seen a great light in certain ways, which you could make an argument that it's part of the text painting. But again, we need more details. You can't just say this is a beautiful chord. It doesn't quite say enough. Nor does it support that this is definitely what the word painting is doing. Same idea is present in the second half of the song, when we feel the shadow of death runs are spooky, and the light shined is the only moments of fulfillment and interestingness that we feel. So there are several mechanical problems here. This should be the light shined are the only moments, because there are two of them. Interestingness, I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Interesting is not a very compelling word to use. It doesn't tell us much of anything. I would avoid it in your writing. Unique is another one. Unique and interesting. Neither of these really tell us anything. It says you want to talk about this for some reason, but you haven't dug down deep enough and really clarified what makes something significant, what makes it important, what makes it worth analyzing, and what do we learn from it. These are questions you should ask yourself whenever you're tempted to say, this was interesting, or this was unique, or this shows an interesting melody, or something like that. What about that makes it interesting? Interestingness is just not a word. The shadow of death runs are spooky. Again, just a little mechanical problem there. It's a little bit tough to understand exactly what they mean. Spooky, not a bad description, but we want to know why. A lot of the emotional meaning of music is, there's some evidence that it's culturally specific. There's some evidence that its aspects are universal. But we definitely want to drill down into what is it that makes me think this music sounds spooky. What is spooky about this piece, whether it's the low register, whether it's the dark harmonies being used, or the particular contour of the melody. So you can't just say, this sounds spooky. You want to know what are the musical elements that makes this sound spooky. Finally, it goes without saying, here's another thing that you really shouldn't use in an academic paper. You wouldn't be writing about it if it went without saying. We really need to hear why this opinion is relevant, or We need to hear a little bit about why, for example, everyone in Handel's audience would have associated the low voice with all things spooky. In this case, I suppose they mean that this aria is written for a bass singer, and that's true, that has certain cultural associations, sometimes with anger in opera, with, older characters, it sort of has some associations with seriousness, but I wouldn't say that it goes without saying that everyone in the audience would have associated this with all things spooky. This is an observation that seems obvious to its author, but really needs to be interrogated more. So as you're going through your second half of this assignment, in which you're assigned to actually write about a piece of music, I would keep some of these pitfalls in mind. You want to keep your verbal, you want to keep the verbal structures of your writing clear. We want to avoid words that don't say much, such as impressive and interesting. We want to interrogate things like immediately apparent or goes without saying. You want to ask yourself why this is apparent. Is it apparent to you, or is it apparent to everyone? Why should it be apparent to everyone? What can I do to help my reader kind of come along and follow the argument? You want to ground the things you say in specific details. What happens here musically to make the emotional tone change? What happens here to make this spooky? You want to always follow up on the musical details, really dig down. So I guess if I were to summarize, I would say be very careful of your verbal structures, the mechanics of writing. There are also, grammatical errors here that you definitely want to avoid. I'll say interrogate your assumptions. I'm running out of space here. Interrogate your assumptions. When you're tempted to say that something is obvious or to assume that everyone is with you, you want to ask yourself, where does that come from? Is that something that is obvious to me, but I need to explain to my reader? Is it something that is obvious to all listeners of a given culture? Really, what makes me think this? What makes me hear it this way? What am I reacting to? You want to ask yourself about your own assumptions. And finally, provide detail. Lots and lots of detail. Anytime you want to say something about a piece of music, you want to actually drill down and say, what is it that makes it sound, for example, spooky? It's not bad to say something sounds spooky, but we want to know that it sounds spooky because the tempo is very slow, because the music is very low pitched, because certain instruments like the string section or the bassoon sound very dark. Isolate the elements that contribute to this impression that you have.